Hey everyone, good evening. We are live with our Sunday night SPSM Chat 2.0 Reboot. Anne-Marie Matulis here as your host, and do I have some guests for you? This is a most unusual evening, but it's also a most unusual topic, and that's a problem. It shouldn't be an unusual topic. We're going to be talking about suicide and PTSD and grief, the intersection there, possibly touch on contagion, and we certainly have a very vibrant and vocal young woman amongst us who's going to tell you all about what it's like to march for our lives, and the connection that is happening now between us. But first and foremost, Trace, introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tracy Medeiros. I'm a suicide attempt survivor, and I'm part of the SPMS chat. Very looking forward to this conversation. It's going to be exciting. I hope we get a lot of, active people out there, put out those questions so I can put them forward.
Thank you. Skye.
Hi, I'm Skye. I'm the Northwest Regional Director for March for Our Lives. I'm also a suicide attempt survivor, and I'm here for all the questions you have for me.
Cool beans. April Foreman.
Hello, I'm at Doc Foreman. I'm your friendly neighborhood suicidologist, and I happen to also have some clinical experience with contagion and clusters, as well as a lot of conversation with just about every stakeholder we could talk with in the last couple of weeks about what the recent suicide deaths of mass shooting survivors means. Like, how do we understand that and what do we do? So I'm here to help Skye, and also I just missed you guys.
Yeah, but you're here now.
Mm-hmm.
Here now. So I'm just, I have to tell you, I've given this a lot of thought this week. I've been reading, and every time I turned around, there was another article. And April, that's something maybe we can touch on somehow through the evening too, is that sudden push from the media, which can always have a double-edged sword to it, but article after article after article after article that was coming out to talk about what seemed to be so shocking to lose two of our young people from Florida, and then lose a dad from Sandy Hook. And what struck me about it and what made me step back were a couple of things. 35 years ago, they didn't know what to call it, but I came out of a very brutal situation with a good 18 months of constant flashbacks. I'd wake up and find myself under a bed or behind the couch, or I had chronic insomnia. I was afraid to sleep because I was afraid I would die that night. And it took me a long time, but I did heal. I have this bounce back ability that I have no idea where it comes from. I know we call it resilience. But as I started to think about it, and I was very grateful to see in one of your comments, that I think it's too easy for people to lump everybody together with post-traumatic stress.
Right.
I function where now, 35 years later, there can be a heartbeat of a minute that's something, a sound, a tone of voice, the height of someone can freeze me. But I mean, it's a split second. I don't even blink. There's been a long process to that. I also had done some digging a few years ago because I was curious about domestic violence, people in particular, like myself. And I was startled to find out that 20% of those who survive the violence and get out, like I did, 20% can experience suicidal ideology and ideation. And that really surprised me. And I thought, where was I in the midst of that? Now, I can tell you that looking back and having a clearer picture, it was like, well, how many times did you say, let me die tonight? So I understand that trauma. But one of the things in my day-to-day feet on the street work is that I haven't struggled, but I've been frustrated, or just, I felt something was lacking as I was dealing with lost survivors in particular, and people who had been traumatized, that there was a piece missing, that all of the information I had in front of me didn't seem to always fit for them. And I am disturbed that, no, disturbed too, that's not an appropriate word. I just feel sad, I guess, to some degree that here in Bristol County, we lost 86 people to suicide in 2018. That leaves us more than 11,000 people bereaved from that.
Correct.
We have 3 kitchen table conversations in our county, and we're lucky if we have 7 people at the table.
Right.
So I'm just going to lay that out there to set a tone, and then I'm going to do what I know is really the right thing. April, the show is yours. Take it away.
I
what would it be?
want to talk about PTSD, especially related to suicide deaths, because suicide is a common way to die, and it's often very traumatic for survivors. You have just the terrible way that somebody goes, which suicide is usually very shocking. People have a hard time sort of processing, like, why did it happen? How can I stop it? Like, they have all the grief reactions, and those are complicated. And then sometimes suicide is even further complicated because you could have found the person after they die. There may be cleanup or damage to where someone lives. And we're talking about suicides following a mass shooting event, which is a horrific trauma, right? But what people don't understand about PTSD and why that 20% number is like making a lot of sense to me is that we're really designed as human beings to survive trauma in all sorts of ways, and including emotional trauma. And so the majority of people who experience them, I'm not saying that trauma won't affect you, but the reason they call it a disorder as opposed to just like, once you experience trauma, that's it, you're sick, is because many of our brains are designed to cope with that in really specific ways. You might have some acute stress, you may have some difficulty in the immediate weeks following. Your brain's really desired to kind of recover. And what we know is that for about 20% or so of brains, 20 to 25% of brains, and these are the same brains that are high at risk for suicide, other kinds of anxiety disorders, substance use. Like, some brains are just not as robust as others. Just like some of us are born with really robust immune systems and some of us are not. Some brains just don't seem to be as set up to survive a trauma. And so there's something about your limbic system that breaks. And I like to say it's like, I restored a historic home once, and it had really old wiring, old knob and tube wiring, and we replaced it with better wiring, some Romex and stuff. And even still, it was never quite right. It was a little glitchy, right? Like, if you plugged in the copy machine in one place and the hair dryer in like another floor in another room, and the whole house, you just had to know not to do that, right? There's just some things like that. So for folks who experience trauma, there's post-traumatic growth. There's having mild reactions that resolve over time. There's having moderate reactions. There's having more severe reactions in PTSD. And there are folks who then, the smaller percentage, are suicidal, have ideation, attempts, or death. And the thing is, it doesn't seem to be anything about you as a person. It seems to be a lot about biological risk factors. And PTSD is the one disorder that we know what causes it. There's a genetic predisposition, something about your limbic system that just is not as robust, and then an exposure to a trauma. And that is how you end up with PTSD. And PTSD has varying degrees of impact. I certainly have experienced traumatic events in my life. If you live long enough, that's likely to happen. And I don't have PTSD. I had a wonderful boss who has PTSD. He lives very well with it, gets care and treatment, is an excellent clinician, all those things. And you have someone who can have it so badly that it makes it hard to hold a job or have relationships, live their daily life, and some who die by suicide, like much more severely. And I guess that's what when we started talking about the suicide deaths of the survivors of Parkland shooting victims and of Sandy Hook, Mr. Jeremy, when we started talking about them, like, well, of course they killed themselves. Like, how could you live with that? Well, the majority of people are going to live with that. It's in varying degrees of distress. And so the idea isn't like to judge it one way or another, but to accept there's just going to be a continuum of impact. And does that help explain?
Yep. Yes, very much so. Skye, you want to jump in for a minute? Tell us about what you're doing or questions.
Hi. Sure. So yeah, just a quick background on how I started out with the March for Our Lives. So I definitely remember my freshman year of high school. That's when Sandy Hook happened. I just remember walking home from school and getting a BBC notification, and I was actually just so shocked. I fell to the ground and started crying when I was just walking home from school. And then in 2016, there was the UCLA, shooting that was just, I say just, but, like it's normalized or not as bad. But there was a student who went and murdered a professor and then died by suicide themselves. But during that time, there was a lot of misinformation. And I knew my best friend was there visiting her boyfriend. And so I called her up expecting her to be in the dorms. And I called her up and she was actually hiding in a closet. She was in the building near where it was happening. She, told me on the phone, she's like, I'm hearing that there's multiple shooters coming this way. I have to call my mom and tell her bye and I love her. And she hung up. And at that point, I didn't know if that was the last thing I was going to hear from her. And that really shook me to my core. That day was really scary. And then, just mass shooting after mass shooting kept happening. And then the Parkland shooting happened. And that one just really got to me. And I saw that it was different because, the Sandy Hook victims, they were babies. They couldn't speak for themselves like the Parkland students started to do. And when I saw them speaking up, I was like, I know I'm older, I'm in college already, but maybe I should start speaking up too. Maybe there's something I can do. There's something more. And then I just started organizing and just organizing different events. I know the first event that I organized was actually a vigil for the Santa Fe shooting that happened a few weeks later that almost no one paid attention to because it was the wedding of Prince Harry and the person, Meghan Markle. Yeah, a lot of people didn't pay attention to that one. It was just 10 people, flew right by over everyone's head that day. But anyway, we know that mental health is an issue that definitely intersects with the gun violence prevention movement. I know specifically doing a lot of work in California that there are over, 7,000 deaths due to suicide by firearm. And if that statistic holds today, then 4 people will have died by suicide today as well, just in California. And then also that suicide by firearm has an 85% completion rate in comparison to other methods, which are 5 to 15% have a completion rate as well. Mm-hmm. And so it's something that, I've been recently doing more research on. And as I've kind of, started looking into this more, I've realized that there are so many issues with, involved with suicide and mental health and firearms. And it's something that I've been hearing a lot lately that's very, very concerning to me, is that I've heard a lot of, suicide attempt survivors saying, if there was a gun, if I knew where the gun was, if I had access to one, I probably wouldn't be here.
You're right.
I've heard that. I heard it once and I was shocked. Yep.
You're right.
And then I've heard it again and again and again. Right. And it's this accessibility to firearms mm-hmm. is also an issue. Mm-hmm. And then more obviously there is, the PTSD that is caused by surviving a situation that has to do with gun violence. And then of course, what happens with PTSD and suicide. And also the PTSD that's different, especially with mass shootings. That's what, at least, correct me if I'm wrong, that's, different than if you're suffering long-term from depression and have a suicide trigger versus if you survived like the Las Vegas shooting, for example, and have a trigger, that those situations would be dealt with a little bit more differently when it comes to trauma. That's something that I've recently been, hearing about, and that obviously we need to do more research on because not many people even know about it.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and it goes even further because there's those who, weren't even directly involved with gun violence, but like the father from Sandy Hook just lost someone, and then what happened to him just, last week. And then even especially the youth that I work with, even youth that haven't, that either experience, community violence on a daily basis, and this is something that affects their mental health. Or even the youth that I work with where they haven't even been directly involved in a situation, but they're going through active shooter drills. I work specifically with, she just turned 11, she's a 10-year-old, and she was going through so many active shooter drills, and the school wasn't letting her know when they were just drills. So she was being traumatized almost on a monthly basis. And this sort of thing for a 10-year-old to have to live with, like, she's already so aware that she's like, I just want to stop this from happening to my younger siblings. I don't want them to go through these drills. And that's, that's a 10-year-old that's trying to register voters and set up meetings with their principal because it's too much. So
that's my 13-year-old coming home from school. She was in middle school, and she comes home from school, and she's like, we had to talk about who's going to get the club, from behind the teacher's desk and run out and say, and I'm like, when you're a child, we shouldn't be talking about who's going to run out and face the gunman. And it's a serious conversation. And I'm like, oh, and you think about what happened in the 50s. Well, I'm going to say it's the 50s, and I'm going to get the date wrong, and all of the history buffs out there will correct me. But when schools were doing duck and cover at their desks because they're like, we're going to get hit by an atomic bomb. Yes. And so we're going to have, the kids duck and cover under their desks. So when problems seem unpredictable and uncontrollable to adults, we create some pretty interesting structure around our children's lives, right? I'm trying here to not be too critical, but at the same time, I'm like, oh my goodness, right? It might be better to solve the problem rather than prepare for it to keep happening. I mean, we're going to have to do both, but like,
it's just we have to stop accommodating. It's really, they're not pro Second Amendment groups, because March for Our Lives is not an anti-gun organization. We are pro self-defense, but they've labeled themselves that way, so it reflects on us in a different manner. Really what they are is anti-gun violence prevention, and they're putting people's lives at risk, and we can't afford to accommodate them anymore. And the one argument I think they have left is, oh, if the government takes over, and that's why we need to have all these stockpiles of weapons. And it's like, we're not going to accommodate your hypothetical theory when we have children going to school and being massacred. We just had a statistic released from this last year that they're saying more students died on campus than our active military and U.S. police combined. So every day I'm stepping on campus, there's a potential that I'm like almost in that sort of same environment, but I'm supposed to be going to school and learning. And more of our active military that are literally across the world fighting, these, crazy things. And I'm just trying to go to school and get an education and have to come to terms with the fact that the environment that I'm in that's supposed to be safe is not safe.
So let's talk about, if it's okay with you, guys, like that ambient sense of lack of safety, lack of predictability, like what that does is that keeps your limbic system on high alert. This is what it means for what's happening inside your body. Your limbic system is that middle part of your brain, right? You have like your brain stem, keeps you alive, your midbrain that sits on top, and then there's that little walnut, your cerebral cortex. And your limbic system is primarily housed in that sort of midbrain that sits on top. And in that midbrain, what it does is it controls the 4 F's, feeding, fleeing, fighting, and mating. Okay. And what it does is it turns on and turns off a bunch of physiological sorts of activities to prepare you to put metabolic energy into each of those things. So when you're eating, you need to be thinking about digestion, right? And so you're going to be hungry, you're going to be driven, you're going to eat, you're going to digest. And then it's going to make you not want to do much else. So if you kind of have Thanksgiving dinner like I do, and you kind of go, oh, just like that, well, that's your limbic system having you kind of chill out so that all of your energy can go into digesting your food. Sexual arousal, very, very similar. It's you're putting a lot of energy into the parts of your body that are getting ready to procreate. Fleeing and fighting are putting a lot of metabolic energy into the things that you need to do to either fight the bear and survive or run away from the bear. And what happens with PTSD Or what happens is when we keep people in fight or fight mode all the time, it really is supposed to be reserved for very rare occasions, right? Bear comes crashing out of the forest and you've got to survive, right? That it's an evolutionary tool, right? But if we keep telling people a bear is coming, a bear is coming, a bear is coming, but no bear is coming, but we're telling people it's in their minds all the time, that sort of ambient level of limbic system arousal, not good for your health. So even if you don't develop PTSD, it will increase your cortisol levels and all sorts of other things. So what happens is a lot of your metabolic energy goes into fight or flight. You don't sleep well, and then a bunch of other things happen to you because you don't rest well because you're staying on high alert all the time. And it's not great for your mental health. And for anybody who has any predisposition for mental illness, and I do, my family has a good amount of anxiety, depressive disorders, right, among several family members. And so I know if I don't sleep well and if I don't take care of myself, like I'm not immune. Like these are things that could happen to me, right? So anybody who could be at risk, like that's sort of a recipe for the initiation of mental illness. And so it's not good to live in. So it's like not a great way of life, and it's not good for your general health. But it also, if you had any biological risk factors, that's when those are going to pop up. And so what we've done, especially in the US, is that we've created an ambient environment where a mass shooting can happen at any time. And we have a lot of environmental cues to keep us reflecting on that these mass shootings are happening and could happen at any time. Even if you never got shot, that is not, it never was in a mass shooting, that would not be good for your wellness, right?
Yeah. And I actually do have a question. I don't know if you would know if that level of ambience actually applies, like, you know, obviously mass shootings are a very small percentage of deaths by gun violence. So for example, in, you know, communities, especially like I'm from Southern California, I'm from Orange County, but when you hear about, you know, Los Angeles and Oakland, and, you know, those students growing up going to more funerals than birthday parties,
yeah.
What is their mental health just trying to walk back and forth from home to school and trying to cope with that factor? How does that affect their mental health?
Excellent question. It is not good for you to be constantly surrounded by violence and the potential for you to be a victim of violence. It is not good for your well-being. And we know that it impacts gene expression. We know that it impacts your development. So children who grow up in that have different long-term life health impacts. We measure traumatic events in childhood by ACEs, right? So the more of those you have, the more likely you're to have all kinds of mental health and physical health complications. It's not good for anyone. It is just not healthy. And if you have any other risk at all, and people do, genetic risk, other things happening, it all compounds. And it increases your risk for suicidal ideation. It increases your risk for death by suicide, the 10th leading cause of death. And it means that you're more likely to be in that 20 to 25% of Americans who are going to experience mental illness. And we should probably be thinking, just like we say, you know, I feed my kids healthy food. I make sure we get exercise. There's a lot of things you do to stay well. It is hard to stay well in an environment that is constantly threatening.
April, I have a question. I have two, actually. Amber sent one. You are, I'm just seeing this. I think I saw it earlier today and I didn't realize what it was. So AAS and the Brady Buzz have a survey out.
Yeah.
Okay, so everybody, Eve Levinson has this on the feed if you see it.
Please fill it out.
If you've been impacted by gun violence. Oh, is he one of your peeps?
So I actually created that that survey that you're talking about right now, with help from the AAS and with support from Brady and also my friend Erin McCall, who has an MS in cognitive psychology and a BS or a BS in cognitive psychology, MS in like research psychology, something statistics in there. So with all of their help, I was able to put together that survey. And thank you, Eve, for helping us put that out there, and for Brady for your support.
That is awesome.
And big thanks to Amelia Leto and Chris Maxwell from AAS who have been supporting it. I just can't thank March for Your Lives or Brady Buzz or any of you guys enough, because like, we didn't like go beg, like you guys came and said, what can we do? And we said, we'll happily help you, and have done an amazing job. What's the goal for this survey? What do you want to have happen?
So it's actually a two-part survey, but the urgency kind of behind it is because we do have the Columbine anniversary coming up on April 20th and the Santa Fe coming up on, I believe, May 10th. Potentially it's in May. And so there is a sense of urgency due to potential for suicide contagion we don't have much research on. And then wanting to bolster any resources that, you know, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline and any other very large, you know, suicide prevention organizations, if we're able to pull together this research that's specifically like how mental health and the gun violence, you know, prevention community intersect. And then also doing a follow-up, a second survey that will come out next week with all of those respondents to ask them specifically where they identified along that spectrum of whether they're in, you know, an activist, lost a loved one, survived something themselves, and following up and getting all of this research to put together sort of like an omnibus memo on, you know, how to discuss a lot of these issues with any members that are coming forward during this, you know, really hard time, and reaching out to all of these suicide prevention resources. So essentially we're just trying to, you know, bolster their efforts, really giving them the pure data, and seeing what we can do, creating, you know, 2 memos, one that will be internal, probably used for those who might be taking phone calls and stuff, as well as an external one, because a lot of times there's just peer-to-peer helping, peer-to-peer counseling. And so if we're able to provide those resources for them, for our own peers, because I do have, you know, people talking to me about how they're feeling as well, then it's something that we can do together as a community, and really, really help each other out. And it's taking a scientific approach, and yeah.
I really, I have to really hand it to you, because this was like, you know, Skye and I were talking before we're coming in, and I started with, you know, an apology. I was a young adult in graduate school when the Columbine shooting happened, and, you know, it's been 20 years, and this group was the first group that said, we're interested in the long-term impact of this on our wellness, and we don't want anyone else to die because of this ground zero traumatic event. So we're going to contribute to understanding it and to getting resources. It shames those of us who are older, that who should be the ones leading this, right? But you all came to us at AAS and asked for assistance, asked for expert advice, and then acted on it. And like, I just couldn't be more impressed.
And I'm speechless. I do have another question for you, April. This came from Amber, and Amber said, I thought suicide contagion is typically a myth.
Nope.
That's why we're encouraged to speak about it. I retweeted and attached it to an SPSM chat to it. Yeah.
So I'm going to disambiguate a few things. So there is a cluster of suicides, so suicide deaths that happen together close in time or close in a network or community, in whatever reason. And you can even, and my clinical experience was with a cluster of suicides from a very specific small group that were happening at the same time every year, finding out how they were related, which was just a tremendous amount of legwork and sort of understanding of a bigger sort of health community context. And so that's a cluster. And so when I was experiencing that for the first time as a clinician, I was responsible for the health of this community and advising this community's leadership about what to do. I then went and asked all the experts at AAS, and they said, well, we haven't done any real good research on clusters or contagion in like 10, 15 years. Lo siento, we'll just look at what's happening and do the best we can, which is what we did. And the end of the story is that people, like, we did a lot of good things for that community, and there were multiple suicide deaths, many suicide attempts, and several people who didn't attempt but were suicidal and at high risk, you know, a group of about 20 people who were all very connected. And so contagion and suicide is just like contagion with the flu. So it's about transmitting risk. So if you live in a town where there's a flu outbreak, people are sharing the virus. And some people, get the virus and their immune system's great and they don't really get a lot of virus and they're fine. They never get symptoms. Some people get very mild symptoms. Some people get moderate symptoms. Some people get very, very ill, and some people die. And so what you're looking for with an outbreak, like measles, for example, they're looking for patient zero, sort of the person that's the node in the network that's spreading the contagion. And so when we talked about suicide contagion, we're just talking about how risk is disseminated or spread. And we've talked about contagion in the media. So the idea is that if the media talks about suicide in just the wrong way, then it will spread risk, right? It'll be like sneezing all over the salad bar right before everybody comes to lunch hour at the Golden Corral, right?
Right.
And so that's what we're talking about for media contagion. And we don't have good science. We have conflicting science and not many studies that if the media doesn't talk about it just so they're spreading risk. Maybe not, and maybe not in the way we think. And if you guys remember, we did that episode that's called Dangerous Words with Micah Nestis, Craig Bryan, and Thomas Joyner, 3 excellent researchers. And by the way, this next week I'm going to be meeting Thomas Nieder Krotenthaler, who is on the other side of it, finding some contagion spread by media. But even if media does spread suicide risk, it's likely in most cases to have a relatively limited impact. Like whatever is adding to the mix, it's likely to be important if it's there, but it's probably not the strongest contagion risks are from close relationships, much like when my kids come home from school with the flu and they get the germs everywhere. And even if I keep everything really, really clean, it gets to me somehow. And we don't know how, but we do know. And if you guys remember, we had Brian Bauer on and Ian Sarrow on. And Ian Sarrow was talking about, and he won a big research award for this, he's a student researcher, that even digitally, we can see that people who are at risk of suicide attempt survivors and people who die are connected to each other more closely than they are, than people with not risks. We know that there's something about risk that is about relationships. We also know, and it's part of any good clinical risk assessment, that if you are very close and connected to somebody who dies by suicide or who attempts suicide, then your risk is higher. And we don't know for sure what the mechanism of that is. And there are multiple explanations for that, and we need a lot of science. But talking about it, I don't think talking about it is the primary driver of contagion. I don't think. But what do we not have? Excellent science. I can tell you how we're transmitting the virus. I can tell you how we transmit HIV. I'm not sure how we're transmitting suicide. Does that help, Amber? Skye, anyone questions?
I have a comment. Just because I had read, I know that the American Association of Suicidology did put out guidelines for the media to responsibly report, and that's something that definitely we're going to be pushing in the next few days leading up to these anniversaries. And also that within that report, it mentioned something interesting, which is that with as little research as we have on suicide contagion, however, it seems that it does impact youth more. So I don't know if you have anything, more to add to that, or just to add that comment.
Possibly. So once again, wouldn't it be great to have more science? But the older that you get, when you're young and you're developing brain and you have a developing narrative, what's happening and how you're processing the world around you is happening differently in your brain as my daughter who's 13, my son who is almost 17, you're 22. and our brains are in different stages of development. Your brain isn't fully developed until you're like 30, 35-ish, right? Which is crazy, but true. And so what we know is that, for example, if you're using drugs for the first time, or certain kinds of drugs when you're using them when you're younger, they impact you differently than if you use them for the first time when you're older. There's something about brain maturation. So if you're exposed to a lot of narratives about suicide, and about other people using suicide as a solution, right as you're building narratives about how the world works, really formative narratives that could impact you. Youth also perceive their environment differently. So they perceive their pain differently. They perceive their environment differently. And there are developmental stages for that. And it's not like as a parent of teenagers, I'm like, oh my God, my teenagers are crazy. They're driving me crazy. But just like my toddler is going through emotional development stages, so are my teenagers. And so like some of them are the spotlight effect, like it feels like everyone's watching you. Some is that you really sort of personalize stories that are going on, and to the extent of it's hard to put things in perspective because your brain's learning how to process social information differently. So it's stuff like that. But you know what we do? I don't know if you knew this, Skye, we do so little research on suicide. So we only spend about $60 million a year researching it. For comparison, HIV, this is just the federal government spends, but HIV is 250, 300 million. So several times that. So there's just stuff we don't know, but that's what we think. And so these guidelines are what we have in place of science, right? What do you think about that?
I think that we should do more, and we should push for more money to be allocated in the right places. You know, I'm definitely a firm proponent, I think, across the board that we have a lot of resources to do the things that we need to do, make our world run, and they're just not allocated properly. So I think that this might be one of those situations where maybe we get a little more money, maybe we see a little bit more results. And you know, that would be nice. Yeah.
Yep, and we know that having a firearm in the house with somebody who's young with all things being equal, increases the risk of your young person dying by suicide 500%. And we think about that there's something very particular in youth and youth suicide that we need to understand that may be different than when a middle-aged person dies by suicide. Anyway, go ahead, Miss Amory.
Okay, it's from Lena Heilman from Colorado, who is also a member in good standing of the Impacted Family and Friends Committee. Yes.
I can't believe you.
I'm counting them as I'm seeing them come down the feed. I went, I can't believe it. Look how many of the committee here. She's got a really important question, though. They all are. What should be the role of postvention after any sort of collective trauma?
Scott Poland was one of the first people that really pioneered this as a really specific thing. And I was so excited and got to, I was a little bit younger. I think it was maybe back in 2008. And I got to go to a workshop by him about postvention, about crisis debriefing. And he talked about the way, in a very traumatic event for school, and this is post-Columbine, and this is also in a world where, students might die by suicide or something else. And he says, we're going to bring everyone together. We're going to talk about what happened. We're going to get a chance to connect. And then we're going to talk about how we're going to, get well or figure out what our plan is, kind of a deal. And he had a very specific method for it. And if you've seen Dr. Jonathan Singer's Suicide in School book, Scott Poland is one of the authors for that. And so postvention, which also could use more science, but it's a good thing. Postvention works best if you start immediately after a suicide death. So, in Baton Rouge where I live, of course, Frank, what is Frank's last name? I can't believe I'm spacing on this.
Frank Campbell?
Frank Campbell. Thank you so much. We was about ready to call him the wrong Frank. And I love him and know him and I live here. Frank Campbell started the Lost Survivor groups. And what we've done is we've sent people right to survivors' homes in the hours following a suicide death to immediately begin talking with them about what's happened and to immediately begin starting to get resources and just immediately sort of start shaping it up. I've done postvention with suicide loss survivors. As a suicide prevention coordinator, that was part of my job. So when I found out that we lost a veteran to suicide, then I was calling their survivors and offering them therapy to come in and talk, offering that if they had the right to look at the medical record and ask questions. Almost always they want to ask me, why did this person kill themselves, and to help them process the fact that we don't know for sure, and that it was not likely one thing, And that while looking back, you can see some things, probably it wasn't like you were negligent. You probably were processing the information of the situation the best you could, and helping people to try to stave off some of that guilt. Because what happens is we tell everyone that there are signs, and here are the signs, and here's what you can do to help people if you just know the signs. Right. And then once somebody's died, then what? And so we have to sort of undo a little of that programming. Like, I'm certain you were paying attention. I'm certain that you love someone. The truth is that the signs are not scientifically based, and there's no one agreed set of signs. And even expert clinicians can't predict this. How could you possibly? Here's what we don't know. A lot of times survivors have one narrative about what's happened, and they think the doctors know things the doctors don't, or they think people know, or they want to sort of find who is responsible and this is why, and giving people permission to not answer the questions because there are no useful answers. Like, I'm like, even if you figured out why, is there an answer that's good enough?
Right.
And that's the question I'll ask. Is there an answer that's good enough? If there was a why, would you be like, okay, this is why they died, I can live with that? Not good enough, right? And so you sort of give people permission to move on, and you give them a lot of access to therapy because they're grieving and it's complicated by all these other things. Does that help with postvention?
Hopefully, Lena will let us know.
Oh, okay.
She's not shy.
I'm terrible. Like, and Skye, you're going to have to stop me. I taught university for a hot minute, and I act like it.
It's okay. I'm in university right now. I'm in my college dorm. So
what are you studying?
International studies.
Oh, very fun. Very fun. So what do you think about what you're hearing from me? Because you're hearing sort of the boilerplates on all these topics, and I'm just fascinated because you're representing the people who are most impacted, right?
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily, I mean, March for Our Lives was started by, by the Parkland students, by the Parkland shooting, which was a mass shooting. And so that's why really a lot of topics that we tend to leave off are going to be, a lot of times people in gun violence statistics, we actually don't include the suicide by firearms as gun violence. I feel like it's really only been recently that we've started to do that, which is it's very interesting to see, like, the whole community kind of turning towards this now. Actually, prior to these suicides, just, in the past few months, that's what I've seen. And so it's just, it's kind of saddening to hear that there's so much of a, you have so much passion and trying to find out, with research and science, what can we do? And what I'm hearing is that you just there's not enough resources being allocated to do the proper research in order to, help solve a lot of these issues. And it's and again, it's very similar to the gun violence movement because, even with gun violence statistics, we don't have a lot of the proper statistics because the CDC can't even do the research it's supposed to because of the NRA-backed Dickey bill that passed in 1996. And so that is very common. What I'm hearing with you is that we don't even have the full statistics of the impact of suicide and suicide statistics in general in the US. And that goes hand in hand with gun violence statistics in general too. We really don't even have those statistics as well. And so it's just, I'm hearing a lot of similarities, and I'm hearing, just that there is a lot more we can do and we should do. And hopefully that's what a lot of the other people listening on this call will get to as well. And so that's kind of, as a community organizer, something that I take on to this is that I want to make a call to action. So that's usually what I do, is a call to action is hey, everyone, just be aware that this is happening. And at the very least, what you can do is talk about it. And that's what we're doing here today, is we're taking that first step, talking about it.
Absolutely. There's been no real public health improvement that didn't come with excellent research, excellent epidemiology, excellent science, excellent public health. Public campaigns are nice, and we want to do them. Obviously, I'm known for loving media, so I agree. But the facts are that when we see big changes in public health issues, the way that we see those is we do excellent science, and that involves measuring. We don't measure suicide very well. We don't. We We just don't. And other countries do. So if you go to Norway, I'd love to introduce you to Lars Mellem and his wife, who are wonderful. And they're the lead epidemiologist in the country of Norway. And he's the head of the International Association for Suicide Research. He's amazing. And Lars will tell you, like, they know every suicide death. They know what happened. They do good epidemiological work, and they know everything that's going on in Norway. Or you can meet Nav Kapoor, who's wonderful. Nav Kapoor is in the UK, right? And he leads a team of 30 plus data scientists who do nothing but look at the data around suicide deaths in the United Kingdom. Who's doing that in the United States?
Well, if I can jump in for a minute, I think now it's only fair to take on Melissa's role. Melissa Brown couldn't join us tonight. I really do want you to meet her, Skye. Melissa works for the CDC, specifically in suicide prevention. We have just formed in AAS a new public health committee. And they have kind of an ambitious agenda. And I don't think it's going to answer all the questions, but I would like to just touch on a couple of the things that they are now discussing. I sat in on their first pre-meeting call. That one of the things they're hoping will come out of this committee through AAS is that it will provide a platform to recruit and engage public health professionals in suicidology, to provide a knowledge base for public health research addressing population community approaches to suicide prevention, that it will develop and disseminate a population level risk reduction strategy, evaluate current efforts for suicide prevention to inform and direct future decision making. And by the way, Skye, none of this should be happening without you at the table. You and your entire organization. No, you specifically and 20-somethings, absolutely. We need to have that voice. You and I had this conversation the other day.
Yes, we did.
April, what we were talking about is I do not understand youth coalitions and youth task forces in which I walk in and there's not anyone under 40 in the room. You know, it's like, that is not a youth organization. You let the young people come in and you leave the room. Trust them. They can do this.
Absolutely, they can.
Yeah.
Well, more important, I don't know that the adults have been really effective. So,
right, I'm not sure, right?
I have too much reverence for the people who didn't solve the problem. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. So the only thing I wanted to touch on is that there are new committees just forming within AAS. And one is the impacted family and friends too. And again, our approach is entirely public health. To say I'm a feet on the street person. I don't understand a lot of the research, probably because I clearly have a block there that I don't want to understand. Maybe, I don't know.
You understand more of the research than 90% of mental health professionals. Come on now.
Right, but I look at the whole picture. You know, when I'm talking to someone who's grieving the loss and is traumatized and is shell shocked, just like the loss team goes out and does. When I have someone sitting me that raw. What I'm looking at is the whole picture of how do we heal this family? How do we heal this soul? How do we help this person find hope and belief that she might wake up again and be okay? And that someday that hole never goes away in your heart, but we can move forward. And how do we prevent? How do we improve quality of life so that risk factor gets shattered and shredded, and we can do that. And I don't have those answers. I don't have those.
I would tell you that what you're looking for with prevention and public health is to, number one, try to help people not get sick in the first place, right? So that's what all those public health campaigns are, like wash your hands, stay home if you're sick, wear a mask at the doctor's office, get the vaccination for flu. So there are all these things of let's prevent you from getting sick. Once you get sick, can you go to the doctor, get diagnosed? And now we have Tamiflu. Can we give you something to ward it off? If you get very sick, when do you go to the hospital? And we know who is most at risk. So the elderly, for example, people with immune system compromise, the very, very young, like those things, like we sort of know that. Well, we really need that for suicide, right? We need that. You know, it was so funny. On the AF listserv, we were talking about prediction. And then John Draper was like, well, once we know who's going to do it, then what? And I'm like, well, we need to predict who. We need to know how that happens. We need to intervene with that. We need to have something for once it's too late, once you've caught it, whatever it is. then that's something that's for us to do for like to stop it from progressing. When it, like we need that entire spectrum of care like we have for any other health issue. And can I talk about it is JJ's Hello Foundation? Have you seen them in the Twitter feed?
Yes, I saw it come up. I can't, April, I can't read it. You talk about it.
And I want to give you a big shout out. This is a father who has lost his son to suicide. His name is Josh Anderson. He's the president co-founder of this because he lost his 12-year-old son to suicide in 2016. And one of the things that we've noticed that's a real common phenomena is that after a suicide death, because they're trying to stop it, like these individual families and communities form nonprofit organizations to try to stop suicide. And I would just love for the public health infrastructure to take as much responsibility as JJ's Hello Foundation and the hundreds and hundreds of other foundations formed by suicide loss survivors and impacted family. Because these individual foundations are not afraid of taking this on. Skye, March for Our Lives is not afraid of taking this on. What can we do to unite all these people who are willing to form foundations, send out information, community organize, like spearhead campaigns? What can we do to great, help me out.
Well, I don't know, is there a coalition of all of these? Do we have do we even just have an Excel sheet that has all of these organizations and foundations listed out?
Go ahead.
JJ's Hello Fund, do we have one?
I'm working with the Heinz Foundation to get one. So I'm working with the Heinz Foundation to start one and host it on the AAS and start adding people to it. Because you're totally right, Skye. We probably need to start with a list of NPOs about suicide prevention and the point of contact. Would love community organizers to help with that.
This is I'm great with networking and doing that. If you need me to help, it's something that I do a lot. So create those connections, because definitely that's exactly where grassroots organizing power comes in. When we all coalesce together and get under the same message, it's hard for us to not be heard. So that's how we get things done.
And that was
I agree.
Instincts behind that was one of the motivations, Skye, behind the impact of family and friends. We were sitting on the corner, millions of us, and you're right, April. And within our group, even here, right here where we are, Tracy and I are, within our group, we had a dad who came to us. He has the Casey Palm Foundation. He has been our primary fundraiser, mover shaker, because he needed to do something. And every time a new one pops up, I keep saying, guys, come on over here, come to this table. Let's all gather on the same table and join forces, not to not interrupt anyone's individuality or autonomy, but the voices, plural, are what's going to make the difference here. Do you realize what time it is, April?
How did that happen?
Oh, that happened very easily.
Hey, I have to tell you, when you're not running the show, you can get, when you're the guest, this is so much more, it's a lot of concentration around the show because you have to kind of make everybody hit their mark, but this is awesome. Thank you, Anne Marie.
Well, we have about 7 minutes. So I'm going to leave that to the two of you to split.
For final thoughts, I have a couple, but I really feel like we should let Skye take us out. I messed with my hair. I cut my hair short so I couldn't clip it back. I'm so sorry, man. The whole show. So number one, we need to do better epidemiology. I think there's a role for psychological autopsies to play when it comes to understanding contagion, when it comes to understanding shared risk. When it comes to understanding population health, Veterans Affairs, I think, does a great job with that, because there's any veteran that dies by suicide that we know of, we do those, whether they're patients or not, and we work really hard on that. And I'm not speaking on their behalf. I just happen to know that, having worked there. But we should be doing like Montana does. We should be looking at every suicide death like an opportunity to learn something that could keep somebody else alive. And is there a way that we could do that? The next thing that I would say for final thoughts is that I hope that Skye will talk more about organizing the people who are impacted. I was reading an article about the history of the HIV activism movement and the ACT UP movement, ACT UP Fight AIDS. Yep. Once again, this was right in Skye, when I was your age, this was a really important movement that was happening, right? I remember when Ryan White died, when Ryan White came out as having AIDS, and I think he had HIV and it had progressed to AIDS, and then lived with it. And then when he died, I remember all of that. The first time I learned what HIV and AIDS were, I was in 4th grade in Mrs. Jackson's class. I fully remember that day. And I remember ACT UP happening as I was a young adult, Skye's age, in the 90s. And I remember when the first cures for AIDS started happening, for HIV. And now you can be undetectable and untransmittable. So you can get HIV and you can get such great health care. And that's happened over the course of my first half of my life. It's entirely possible. But you know what happened? The activism movement involved the impacted family and involved people with lived experience. And they had a lot of different voices. They had a lot of different beliefs. They had a lot of different organizations or different ways of getting to that end goal, but they shared them. And those organizations were very tight and very unified around that goal of fighting AIDS.
Absolutely.
And then once things were cured, they kind of all then went their separate ways. There's still wonderful organizations going on. They'll kind of do their separate thing. I think now is the moment for suicide prevention. Now is the moment to talk about firearm deaths and to talk about suicide and firearm deaths, right? Now is the moment to talk about these mass shooting deaths that are primarily driven by suicide and the public health problems. And people are going to have different opinions, different objectives. But I think, Skye, you're right. I think that there are a lot of smart people out there like me, but we can only do what we are funded to do or what we're supported in doing. The people who create that public will, those are the impacted family members. And I won't be allowed, authorized, or funded to do the things I think will help the world without that broad public will. And I'm going to give it to Skye to take us out.
Yeah, I think something really like a role that's just coming to my mind as we're discussing all of this is that it's, it's not only, the gun violence community that's really affected. And now we're kind of stepping up and doing our own research on ourselves to help, bolster your efforts to help us. And it's really like this, this self-sufficiency that a lot of these groups have to step up when we don't have anyone else, like when we think our government maybe should be helping us and there's reasons that they can't. And so what I'm thinking is, as a suicide prevention and mental health group community coalesce, and underneath that there are groups like March for Our Lives, but then there's so many other impacted communities with specific issues, whether it is like sexual assault or just living in oppressed communities, or there's so many different issues where I'm thinking that these communities believe that there's these resources that are really readily available and have this research done to help them in their time of need. And there are these resources that exist, but they can be better, they can be improved. And so as you all are coalescing under this, this coalition that you're talking about putting together, then we can all come together as these different impacted groups and even help self-provide that research so you can help us in turn. And I think, that's a really beautiful effort up until we can get, maybe the government to step in more and help us if that's the case or something else. But until then, it's like this self-sufficiency that kind of, it also happened with March for Our Lives. And we were like, we had been looking to our leaders to make a difference and say something, and then they're not. And so it's like, well, we're still dying, in schools in our communities. What do we do? And it's like, I guess we become our own leaders and we're just going to do it ourselves. And so that's kind of like, I'm sensing that's what we have to do, is we can't rely on anyone anymore. But you as the mental health community, you know, with suicidology, you can help say what is missing, even if it's hard to say publicly. This is what we're missing. Can this community, as you as a community, help us to help you? Because you don't even have the resources yourself to do that. And so if we don't know what's missing, we can't help. And so that's where our own communities can help step in. And we have these intersections of mental health and suicidology with all of these different communities. And then, of course, I think, you know, that March for Our Lives and the GBP movement will also have a special role outside of just being an impacted community itself, because of, you know, firearms and what they can do in relation to suicide. So there is a little bit of a separation between our community being impacted, but also having research on these tools that are used to, you know, more effectively complete suicide. So, and I just want to leave, you know, more again with that call to action of, we all just really need to come together. It just starts with a conversation. I know Sandy Hook Promise starts with hello. That's what they do. And so I think that's how we keep this movement going. We're starting it. Maybe even here tonight was a big step forward too. I think that it's a big moment for all of us to have come here between our different movements. Maybe we wouldn't have seen ourselves here a while ago, but here we are at the table, and it's definitely an ongoing conversation.
I'm happy to be in the conversation with you. I just want to thank the youth of March for Our Lives and your young leadership for taking the initiative, reaching out, and collaborating. I'm like, this is how it's done. I don't. Like I said, don't walk in the room and be reverent to the people who haven't solved the problem. Like this is what we should do. And I'm glad you're here.
I'm glad you're both here tonight. I have a feeling this is not a one and done conversation. We need to keep this going. And from the look on the Twitter feed, I think that's probably a unanimous vote. So we will be back together again. And in the meantime, we'll keep in touch. Thank you both so much. Skye, thank you so much. April, awesome to see you behind that curtain, in front of that curtain again.
Out of the red curtain, yeah.
It is.
Good to be here.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.